In this video, we're going to be studying Charlotte Bronte's brilliant and extremely complex novel, Jane Eyre, in which she examines the problems faced by a young woman as she tries to establish individual identity and autonomy in a society that doesn't recognize that for either. Jane struggles with a series of problems related both to social class and gender. Not only is she a young woman, but she's a young woman, although born the daughter of a gentleman who is an orphan and therefore has no family and has no money of her own. And so she struggles to establish a social position which allows her the freedom, individuality, and autonomy to pursue her own interests in a society that doesn't believe she has a right to any personal interests beyond the service to others. The novel can be conveniently divided up for study into 4 separate sections, the first section having 2 subsections. The first section is Jane's life with her Aunt Reed and her cousins, and the second part of the first section is her experiences at Lowood School. And this section of the novel describes the experiences that form Jane into the character she becomes when she enters the second section, which is her life at Thornfield, Mr. Rochester's home. The third section is when she flees Thornfield and Rochester, having discovered that Rochester is already married to a crazy woman that he is keeping in his attic, and flees to Marsh End, where she meets the people who will eventually turn out to be her cousins. And then the final section is when she comes back to find Rochester maimed as a result of his experiences with the burning and destruction of Thornfield. So these are the sections that we'll be talking about as we go through the novel, and we'll be looking at the way that first Jane develops the personality that allows her to exist in a world that is hostile and unsympathetic to a woman who has aspirations beyond darning socks. And then how she protects that personality from 2 mirrored assaults. One from Rochester, who attempts to get to the inner truth of Jane and free her passionate interior, and the other, St. John Rivers, who attempts to destroy or bury the passionate interior life of Jane under an extremely repressive exterior, both of which Jane feels are existential threats to her personality. The novel is Jane's attempt to survive these various threats to the integrity and autonomy of her personality. Now, the novel is often horribly misread as a romantic love story in which a young, poor woman falls in love with her soulmate, her employer, who ultimately she gets to marry. But the reality is it's very different. This is not a romance novel. It's a psychological thriller, as Jane attempts to survive assaults on her personality, first from Rochester and then from St. John. And in Rochester's case, a particularly devious assault that, once we understand what's really going on in the novel, starts to look a lot like psychological manipulation, grooming, and an assault on Jane's integrity. So in the novel, Jane ultimately has to find a way to survive these assaults on her integrity and come through unscathed and intact. We're now going to turn our attention to the first part of the novel, in which Jane recognizes that as a young woman without money, class, or beauty, she has to find a way to establish for herself a space in which she can pursue her interests. The first step is to recognize that a young woman without money or social position, regardless of how convinced she is of her own abilities and deserts, is not recognized as an autonomous individual with a right to establish or demand the space in which to act in her society. She occupies a position which is very liminal. In Latin, the word limen means threshold, and a liminal image is a threshold image. It's the image of something in between 2 separate states. In a literal sense, a threshold is the space between the inside and the outside of a building, and Jane Eyre is very much in this liminal space. She is a young woman born the daughter of a gentleman, but a gentleman who has passed away, and she has no wealth or money of her own. She has no physical beauty, which the novel makes clear is important at several instances, and she has no power. And so she has to recognize what traits and abilities she has that will allow her to exit this liminal space and become a member of society. At the beginning of the novel, she's an orphan without money, social status, or position. Later, she becomes a governess. A governess is also very much a liminal position because although she has the accomplishments and abilities of a woman of the upper classes, she can play the piano, she can draw, she can speak multiple languages, she is still an employee working for her living and therefore not a member of the gentry. And on the other hand, because she has those accomplishments, because she's educated, she's not a member of the service class. And so she doesn't fit neatly into either class. And so she will very much be in this liminal position throughout her career. And her job is to find a way to exit that liminal state and become a fully functional, fully authorized member of her society. A privilege that is denied women and people of lower class in general in Victorian England.
At the end of A Christmas Carol, the last part of Scrooge's reform is that he is subjected to the surveillance of the future. In other words, the unseen eyes of the future are constantly watching every single thing he does and judging him. In addition to having his sympathy weakened by the Christmas past, by sympathizing with his own plight as a child and learning about the joy and pleasure that he can bring to others as opposed to the sorrow he's bringing by his miserliness. The Ghost of Christmas Future also threatens him with the surveillance watching his every move and judging him upon it. And so there's an implicit threat in that if he's not a good guy, the future will forget him. This should remind you of Jeremy Bentham's idea of the panopticon that we talked about a while back.
Jeremy Bentham proposed his panopticon as a model for the distribution of power and control in a civil society.
It is an octagonal building as Bentham originally designed it. It's a model for a prison. Panopticon, the word panopticon means literally see everything. It's an octagonal building with cells arranged around the perimeter of the building, all of them blocked off so no one in the cell can see into the next cell, but everyone can see out to the middle, and more importantly, anyone sitting in the middle can see inside. And then there are bars around to keep the prisoners in. The back of each cell, there's a window letting light in, so they're backlit, so everyone is able to see in. Then in the middle, there is an observation tower. And the observation tower is placed in such a way that from inside the observation tower, you can see into any of the cells at any point. Then there is the last innovation that Bentham proposed, which is the thing that makes it sort of insidious, which is the observation tower will be enclosed in one-way glass, which means it will be mirrored from the outside, but you can see through it from the inside. So no one in the cell can see into the observation tower. And since they never know whether or not they're being watched, at any point, they don't know if someone's in the observation tower or not, they could be watched at any moment. And so what ends up happening is that the prisoners within the cells police themselves because they don't know if someone else is outside of them to police them. So they're charged with their own self-control, because if they violate their self-control, if they don't restrain their own behavior, at some point someone might watch them. Now, this idea of the panopticon is taken as a model by philosopher Michel Foucault in a book called Discipline and Punish, and he argues that Bentham's panopticon becomes a model for society after the Industrial Revolution. He actually says after the 1700s, but it's really the Industrial Revolution and the shift toward individualism that causes this. He argues that this is how modern society works, that we are always being observed by someone, as Scrooge is being observed by the future. And as a result of that, we have to constantly police our own behavior, because if we don't, someone will see us. As I mentioned when we talked about this before, he argues that before this time in a feudal society, the only people you had to be worried about were the actual enforcers of the law, the people in social societies above you. People around you had no power over you. But in a disciplined society, Foucault argues, the people around you can inform on you. You need to watch out because your neighbors are the people who are going to inform on you. But anyway, this is a disciplined society according to Foucault. This is the society within which Jane Eyre takes place. When we read the novel, one of the things I want you to pay attention to is how often in Jane Eyre she says things like seeing myself unseen, where she's hiding in the shadows and watching other people. And although she doesn't fully realize it, that's happening to her as well. She's both being surveyed and she's using surveillance. And it actually becomes a form of power. In this novel, the powerful people are the ones who are able to see through surface appearances and understand what's really going on. And the powerless people are the people who don't understand what's really going on. And if you know what's going on, if you're the person who's able to see through the other people, then you gain control. This is the only kind of power that's available to Jane, but it's also the kind of power to which she's subject. My argument will be is that in this novel, Jane has two sides to her personality. There is the exterior side. So this is Jane. And this is a graphic representation of Jane. From the outside, she takes pains to create a nondescript, deliberately plain appearance. She actually tells us at one point that she had to dress up to go down to dinner. And so she took off her normal black stuff dress and put on her gray dress, which is the nicest dress she had. So woohoo, her big fancy dress is a gray dress. And she deliberately, she tells you she maintains this plain exterior. And so one of the reasons to do that is so that people looking at her will look outside and they won't be able to see who she really is. However, within this, she has a very active and passionate internal life, which is hidden by this hard, plain shell. This is how she protects herself.
Both of these sides are essential to her personality. The passionate interior life, which defines her, but the hard, plain shell by which she protects herself from the surveillant intrusions of others.
In the novel, she will face two threats. The first threat that she faces is going to be Rochester. And Rochester is making every effort, and ultimately he's successful, to pierce through the external shell and to figure out what's going on inside this apparently plain girl. He is using all sorts of means at his control to do this. On the other hand, we will have St. John. His name is pronounced St. John. It's spelled St. John, but it's pronounced St. John. St. John doesn't give a damn about the internal stuff. In fact, he would rather not have the passionate internal life. It really bothers him. He is trying to eliminate the passionate internal life and focus on the shell. So Rochester poses a threat to her self-control. St. John poses a threat to her passionate internal life. And so the novel is Jane navigating through these threats to her personal integrity. And we'll see as we go through the novel how these threats materialize. Now, the problem that Jane faces is that Jane also is constantly trying to look out and understand people. And she is able to look out, for instance, and understand Blanche Ingram. And as a result, Jane actually has power over Blanche Ingram, although Jane herself doesn't fully recognize the power she has. But she's not able, even though she thinks she is, to fully understand Rochester. Now, this is one of those novels that you have to read twice, because the first time you read it, at least up through the first half of the novel, you don't really know what's going on. And then once you really know what's going on, you realize you completely misunderstood everything you thought was going on in the first half. Rochester has a secret that is essential to understanding his personality. Jane doesn't know the secret. And because Jane doesn't know the secret, she's unable to understand his personality. And once she does understand the secret and knows something about his personality, then she is better able to control him. And that passage in which she finally finds out what's going on is just fascinating. It's like a Hitchcock movie, the psychological drama, these two people playing with each other, and Rochester trying to break her down, and she trying to fight him off in this psychological drama. Before we get started looking at Jane Eyre, it's worthwhile talking a little bit about Charlotte Bronte, because she's a fascinating character in herself. She and her 5 siblings were born to a rural vicar. He was kind of a low-level minister at a church in Haworth, which was in the northern section of England in the moors, in the heath. And her siblings, you're probably familiar with her 2 famous siblings, or at least one of her famous siblings is Emily Bronte, who wrote Wuthering Heights. And then Anne Bronte was also an author and actually wrote The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which is an interesting novel. And she also wrote Agnes Grey, which I've tried to read 3 or 4 times and have never been able to get past the first chapter before I close the book and go, oh God, I can't read this. But The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is pretty interesting. And then, of course, Wuthering Heights is a fascinating novel in which a narrator who does not understand the people he's describing is trying to describe two very wild, romantic sort of characters and their complex relationship. Charlotte Bronte, of course, also wrote multiple novels. Her first novel was called The Professor. It was not accepted for publication. Her second novel was Jane Eyre, which was accepted for publication and was very successful. And then she revised
The Professor
into another novel, which became Villette, which is absolutely fascinating. And I have taught it in this class. Villette is fun. If you like Jane Eyre, you may really like Villette. They had 2 other daughters, Maria and Elizabeth, who both died in youth at a school very much like the school in Jane Eyre. And the story of Helen Burns dying is based upon Charlotte Bronte's actual experience. So Maria and Elizabeth died. Charlotte, Emily, and Anne all survived into adulthood, but all died early in their adulthood. They also had a brother, Branwell, who was a poet.
Who died young as the result of a dissolute life.
As children, the Bronte siblings had constructed their own very complex little play world, virtual reality, in which they had novels for it and characters and this whole kind of virtual reality going on. It's really fascinating to see their juvenilia, because their juvenilia, they already had a very rich, imaginative life, even though they were trapped up north, away from the city and away from meaningful social relationships outside of their own family. They still had an active, imaginative life, which then surfaced in each of their own literary creations. Jane Eyre itself is an interesting novel. There's a bit of history about it. Look at the beginning of Jane Eyre. It's dedicated to William Makepeace Thackeray. He was not terribly happy about the dedication, though, which she discovered when she went to visit him in London. One of the things that Charlotte Bronte did not know, because it wasn't widely published, was that William Makepeace Thackeray's wife suffered from what we would think of as bipolar disorder, had periods of relative lucidity, had periods of depression, and then had manic stages, and had to be institutionalized. So he loved her dearly and visited her regularly and took care of her throughout his whole life. And they never were able to live together once she was institutionalized. So she was actually a mad woman put away in an institution. And so when Bronte dedicated a novel to Thackeray, one of the main features which is there is a crazed wife locked away in an attic, he did not take it terribly well.
Before we begin the novel, I'd just like to point out how familiar Charlotte Bronte would be with the position of a woman in Victorian society, especially a woman who is an author. 2/3 of a century later, Virginia Woolf will write an essay called Professions for Women, in which she talks about the problems of a woman trying to establish a professional identity, and she uses her own experience as a woman author. And in that essay, she attributes the relative ease with which women can become authors to their female predecessors, one of whom is clearly Charlotte Bronte. But Charlotte Bronte herself does not have that same advantage. Although there are numerous women authors writing in the 19th century, and some of them very successful, they tend to be categorized as, quote, women authors, unquote. In other words, they're allowed to write a certain kind of domestic fiction or romantic fiction or gothic fiction, but they're not taken seriously as authors. And other female authors have also recognized this problem and been forced to publish under male pseudonyms to be taken seriously. George Eliot, whose actual name is Marianne Evans Lewis, is a perfect example of this, because when George Eliot first started publishing under the name George Eliot, the novels were reviewed very well. When it became clear later that she was actually Marianne Evans, a female, the novels were still well received by critics, but the kind of criticism changed significantly. They went from being described, as they had been earlier, as insightful examinations of political life in rural England to celebrations of the roles of people within domestic circumstances. In other words, a female author couldn't know anything about politics, but she could know about household duties because, of course, that's where women reside, and so therefore that's what she must be writing about. So the Bronte sisters, Emily, Anne, and Charlotte, were forced to publish under male pseudonyms. In this particular case, it's Currer Bell. They were Ellis, Acton, and Currer Bell when they published their novels, and it wasn't until much later that they were revealed to be women. So the fact that Charlotte Bronte felt it important to assume a male pseudonym shows how clearly she understood that a woman's role within Victorian England, especially for a woman who longed for more than simply darning socks, was very carefully circumscribed by the expectations of Victorian society. So the novel begins with one of the most famous beginning lines, setting us literally in medias res. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. We had been wandering, indeed, in the leafless shrubbery an hour in the morning, but since dinner, Mrs. Reed, when there was no company, dined early, the cold winter wind had brought with it clouds so somber and rain so penetrating that further outdoor exercise was now out of the question. I was glad of it. I never liked long walks, especially on chilly afternoons. Dreadful to me was the coming home in the raw twilight with nipped fingers and toes, and a heart saddened by the chidings of Bessie, the nurse, and humbled by the consciousness of my inferiority to Eliza, Jane, and Georgiana Reed. The said Eliza, John, and Georgiana were now clustered round their mamma in the drawing-room. She lay reclined on a sofa by the fireside, and with her darlings about her, for a time neither quarreling nor crying, looked perfectly happy. Me she had dispensed from joining the group, saying, "She regretted to be under the necessity of keeping me at a distance, but that until she heard from Bessie and could discover by her own observation that I was endeavoring in good earnest to acquire a more sociable and childlike disposition, a more attractive and sprightly manner, something lighter, franker, more natural, as it were, she really must exclude me from the privileges intended only for contented, happy little children." "What does Bessie say I have done?" I asked. "Jane, I don't like cavillers or questioners. Besides, there is something truly forbidding in a child taking up her elders in that manner. Be seated somewhere, and until you can speak pleasantly, remain silent." So, among other things we learn about Jane in this opening section is the fact that she has already established a position for herself outside the family. The second thing we learn about Jane, and this turns out to be very important, is that she has a strong sense of her own rights and her needs to establish her own space in culture. And the third thing that we learn about Jane is that she is not afraid to challenge her superiors. What, when I was a kid, my parents called backtalk, which was guaranteed to get me punished. Rather than listening to what Mrs. Reed says and doing what Mrs. Reed expects, she challenges her. "What does Bessie say I have done?" And Mrs. Reed clearly is put off by this. Now, I understand that we are seeing this novel told from the perspective of Jane Eyre herself. It's important to keep in mind that we have two different versions of Jane present all throughout the novel. We have the Jane who is experiencing the events that we see described in the novel. But we also have the adult, much older Jane Eyre who is remembering this and who knows what will happen in the novel, and also whose experiences and expectations and knowledge color the way that she describes what we're told. So one of the things we have to figure out when we read this is, how does the older Jane see the younger Jane? Now, it's quite clear that the younger Jane is someone who is not afraid to express her opinion. Now, while this seems to us in the 21st century a perfectly acceptable and admirable quality, we have to remember that we're reading a novel that was written in 1848, and that a child is expected to be seen and not heard. A female child is rarely even expected to be seen. She's supposed to be modest, quiet, and retiring. And further, and on top of that, a child who is dependent on the family for their survival but is not an immediate member of the family, is supposed to be grateful and conciliatory even under unjust or harsh treatment because she has no other options. And Jane is challenging those expectations. Now, certainly the novel and we see this as an admirable quality. It's important to keep in mind that those people around Jane will see this as incorrigible self-assertion and insubordination. And in Jane's case, she is actually in danger of being seen literally as crazy. And this is something that we're going to have to look at because madness is an important theme in this novel. If you haven't already read to the point where it becomes clear that madness is an important theme in this novel, being seen as crazy can have serious negative repercussions. Crazy people are institutionalized, and if one doesn't learn to control oneself, one is in danger of being controlled by others, as Jane finds out firsthand. And Jane herself has a tendency to act out in a way that to people outside would certainly be seen as crazy, because here is an orphaned young woman with no family other than the Reeds that she knows of, although we will find out later that she actually does have family in a significant plot twist. No other hope of resource than Mrs. Reed, and she is risking losing all of that in an attempt to assert self-control. So she is literally risking being thrown out of the only resource she has. She has well-prepared food, she has clothing provided for her, she has heat, she has a bed. All of those things she is risking losing by acting crazy. And so we need to look at how that craziness asserts itself, both from Jane's perspective, where it simply is self-assertion, and from the perspective of those people who are not Jane, who watch her act out in this way. Immediately in the novel, we're exposed to Jane's liminal position, both inside and outside, both inside this family and outside of this family, which will relate to her later liminal position as a governess, both inside the family and outside. She has immediate care over the children. She functions in loco parentis for the children of a family, but nevertheless, she's not part of the family. In the beginning of the novel, we see her occupying literally a space that is both inside and outside the house. She's sitting in a window seat with only glass separating her from the outside and a heavy curtain separating her from the inside. And so the initial position we see her in at the beginning of the novel is this liminal inside and outside place. A small breakfast room adjoined the drawing room, and I slipped in there. It contained a bookcase. I soon possessed myself of a volume, and taking care it should be one stored with pictures, I mounted into the window seat. Gathering up my feet, I sat cross-legged like a Turk, and having drawn the red moreen curtain nearly close, I was shrined in double retirement. Folds of scarlet drapery shut in my view to the right hand. To the left were clear panes of glass, protecting but not separating me from the drear November day. Protecting but not separating me from the drear November day. At intervals, while turning over the leaves of my book, I studied the aspect of that winter afternoon. So she's clearly both inside and outside the house. Now, it would be delightful if we had time to go through every single line or passage of this book in careful detail and do it justice, but we simply don't have that amount of time. So we're going to have to focus in our discussion upon really significant elements. And the significant element here is her confrontation with John Reed. And so we're going to skip forward slightly and look at John Reed coming running into the room. Now, it's clear that her cousin John Reed is represented in the novel as stupid, lazy, and a mean bully. And so John decides that he is going to assert his rights as the master of the house because his father is dead, and demands that Jane show him the book, and then he's going to punish Jane for having taken the family's possessions without his permission. He talks to her, she talks back, he has her stand away from the windows. She doesn't realize why until she realizes that he's about to throw the book at her, which he does, and the book knocks her over, she hits her head, cuts her head, and starts bleeding. This is on page 3. But when I saw him lift and poise the book and stand in act to hurl it, I instinctively started aside with a cry of alarm. Not soon enough, however, the volume was flung, it hit me, and I fell, striking my head against the door and cutting it. The cut bled. The pain was sharp. My terror had passed its climax. Other feelings succeeded. And we need to watch out throughout this novel, because if you watch carefully, look at how many times Jane feels these other feelings surfacing within her. These feelings surface involuntarily and are often described as the feelings of something inside of her, almost as if they are the feelings of another being residing within Jane. These are feelings of rebelliousness, which, if not carefully contained, cause Jane to act out. And so she does. She challenges him, but then he fights back. He ran headlong at me. I felt him grasp my hair and my shoulder. He had closed with a desperate thing. I really saw in him a tyrant, a murderer. I felt a drop or two of blood from my head trickle down my neck, and was sensible of somewhat pungent suffering. These sensations for a time predominated over fear. I received him in frantic sort. I don't very well know what I did with my hands, but he called me rat, rat, and bellowed out aloud. Aid was near him. Eliza and Georgiana had run for Mrs. Reed, who was gone upstairs. She now came upon the scene, followed by Bessie and her maid Abbott. We were parted. Dear, dear, what a fury to fly at Master John! Did anybody ever see such a picture of passion? Then Mrs. Reed subjoined, Take her away to the Red Room, and lock her in there. 4 hands were immediately laid upon me, and I was borne upstairs. So look at this scene from the perspective of the Reeds. We see it from Jane's perspective, but from the Reeds' perspective, here is this child that they are taking care of in their house, even though they have no real obligation to do so, who has just attacked their loved son with minimal provocation. And so rather than John being accused of being a bully, because he in some sense actually has the right to be a bully, it is of course Jane who's accused. What a fury to fly at Master John. What a picture of passion. So Jane's unconstrained feelings are what get her held down and subdued and then locked in the Red Room, which will later become one of the scenes of sort of gothic horror. We're already establishing the pattern where unconstrained emotion or madness leads to incarceration. I resisted all the way, a new thing for me, and a circumstance which greatly strengthened the bad opinion Bessie and Miss Abbott were disposed to entertain of me. The fact is, I was a trifle beside myself, or rather out of myself, as the French would say. I was conscious that a moment's mutiny had already rendered me liable to strange penalties, and like any other rebel slave, I felt resolved in my desperation to go all lengths. I was a trifle beside myself, or rather out of myself. She has lost all self-control. She is acting out, and as a result of that, as we will see, she will be labeled as insane. And we get the very first mention of madness in the next line. Hold arms, Miss Abbott, she's like a mad cat. For shame, cried the lady's maid. What shocking conduct, Miss Eyre, to strike a young gentleman, your benefactress's son, your young master. Master, how is he my master? Am I a servant? No, you are less than a servant, for you do nothing for your keep. There, sit down and think over your wickedness. And so Jane is already being identified as insane. And the reason she's being identified as insane is that from the perspective of people outside of Jane, however justified Jane and we see her behavior, because we understand it from her first-person perspective, from the people who are outside of her, they see her as crazy because she is striking a young gentleman, your benefactress's son, your young master. Master, how is he my master? Am I a servant? No, you are less than a servant, for you do nothing for your keep. So her wickedness and her insanity is to threaten her position here by challenging and fighting back against the very people who support her, provide her with food, clothing, housing, and livelihood. On the next page, Bessie and Miss Abbott discuss Jane and show us exactly what her position is in the house. Miss Abbott says, she's an underhand little thing. I never saw a girl of her age with so much cover, which actually turns out to be a very important line describing Jane throughout the novel, because cover, or a mask to block access to what's really going on within her psyche and personality, is an essential characteristic of Jane's personality throughout the novel, and ultimately one of the means that she uses to gain control of herself and establish a space in which she can do what she feels she needs to. But Bessie goes on and explains exactly why Jane's behavior seems crazy to them. You ought to be aware, miss, that you are under obligations to Mrs. Reed. She keeps you. If she were to turn you off, you would have to go to the poorhouse. and you ought not to think yourself on an equality with the Mrs. Reed and Master Reed, because Mrs. kindly allows you to be brought up with them. They will have a great deal of money, and you will have none. It is your place to be humble and to try to make yourself agreeable to them. What we tell you is for your own good, added Bessie in no harsh voice. You should try to be useful and pleasant. Then perhaps you will have a home here. But if you become passionate and rude, Mrs. will send you away, I am sure. So literally for Jane, the continuation of this behavior threatens to get her thrown out. Mrs. will send you away. And she, at this point, has no other resource except for, as we will discover later, charity school, where she ultimately ends up. Later on page 5, Jane contemplates the reasons why she feels so out of place here, not the least of which is her perceived superiority to her cousins and her aunt. I was a discord in Gateshead Hall. I was like nobody there. I had nothing in harmony with Mrs. Reed or her children, or her chosen vassalage. If they did not love me, in fact, as little did I love them. They were not bound to regard with affection a thing that could not sympathize with one amongst them, a heterogeneous thing, opposed to them in temperament, in capacity, and propensities, a useless thing, incapable of serving their interest or adding to their pleasure, a noxious thing, cherishing the germs of indignation at their treatment and contempt of their judgment. I know that had I been a sanguine, brilliant, careless, exacting, handsome, romping child, though equally dependent and friendless, Mrs. Reed would have endured my presence more complacently. Her children would have entertained for me more of the cordiality of fellow feeling. The servants would have been less prone to make me the scapegoat of the nursery. So clearly she doesn't fit in, and the reason she doesn't fit in is because her personality and her abilities are very different from those of the people within the house. But nevertheless, Jane, as a young woman, doesn't recognize that by engaging in her own desires, she's threatening her position in this household. I'd love to talk about the gothic elements in this scene in the Red Room where she thinks she sees a ghost, but unfortunately we just simply don't have time. In another scene, on page 9, Jane again engages in her out of herself, as she says, behavior. Eliza and Georgiana, evidently acting according to orders, spoke to me as little as possible. John thrust his tongue in his cheek whenever he saw me, and once attempted chastisement, but as I instantly turned against him, roused by the same sentiment of deep ire and desperate revolt which had stirred my corruption before, he thought it better to desist, and ran from me uttering execrations and vowing I had burst his nose. So she punches him in the face, in other words. I had indeed leveled at that prominent feature as hard a blow as my knuckles could inflict, and when I saw that either that or my look daunted him, I had the greatest inclination to follow up my advantage to purpose. But he was already with his mamma. I heard him in a blubbering tone commence the tale of how that nasty Jane Eyre had flown at him like a mad cat. He was stopped rather harshly. Don't talk to me about her, John. I told you not to go near her. She is not worthy of notice. I do not choose that either you or your sister should associate with her. Here, leaning over the banister, I cried out suddenly, and without at all deliberating on my words, "They are not fit to associate with me!" I just want to call your attention to the fact that she is crying out suddenly without at all deliberating on my words, which, of course, is a case of her acting out of herself again. Mrs. Reed runs up, grabs her, takes her to the nursery, slams her down in a chair, and Jane challenges Mrs. Reed. What would Uncle Reed say to you if he were alive, was my scarcely voluntary demand. I say scarcely voluntary, for it seemed as if my tongue pronounced the words without my will consenting to their utterance. Something spoke out of me over which I had no control. What? Said Mrs. Reed under her breath. Her usually cold, composed eye became troubled with a look like fear. She took her hand from my arm and gazed at me as she really did not know if I were a child or a fiend. I was now in for it. Jane's behavior, once again, however justified from the first-person point of view from which we are seeing the novel, from the outside does in fact look insane, and even Jane acknowledges it. My tongue pronounced the words without my will consenting to their utterance. Something spoke out of me over which I had no control. She's literally sacrificed her control to her inner self. Her id is overriding her superego and speaking out of her. And Mrs. Reed's fear in this case could be interpreted as the fear of someone confronting a crazy person, someone who is behaving in a way that doesn't seem consistent with sane, logical, rational behavior. The final scene that actually gets Jane thrown out of the house is when Mrs. Reed invites Mr. Brocklehurst, who is the headmaster of a charity school called Lowood Institute. Mrs. Reed is seeking to have Jane placed in this charity school. In fact, Jane has managed to get herself thrown out of this house and will go to what she does not yet know are much worse living conditions. Her insanity has cost her her living conditions, and it's not that she will gain relative freedom even by the change. She's actually going to be under much more carefully controlled institutional care. And how she manages to provoke this behavior through her insanity comes to a head after Mr. Brocklehurst leaves. Now, it's worth looking carefully at Mr. Brocklehurst's interview of Jane because it's a little bit funny in some cases. But after Mr. Brocklehurst leaves, Jane confronts her Aunt Reed the one final time. With these words, Mr. Brocklehurst put into my hand a thin pamphlet sewn in a cover. Having rung for his carriage, he departed. Mrs. Reed and I were left alone. Some minutes passed in silence. She was sewing. I was watching her. Then Jane describes Mrs. Reed in some detail. On the next page, sitting on a low stool a few yards from her armchair, I examined her figure. I perused her features. In my hand I held the tract containing the sudden death of the liar, to which narrative my attention had been pointed as an appropriate warning. What had just passed, what Mrs. Reed had said concerning me to Mr. Brocklehurst, the whole tenor of their conversation was recent, raw, and stinging in my mind. I had felt every word as acutely as I had heard it plainly, and a passion of resentment fomented now within me. The first thing we need to pay attention to is a characteristic that Jane will have throughout the novel, and which we always need to watch because it's very important in a novel in which surveillance is the method by which one maintains control, which is that she examines other people. I examined her figure, I perused her features. The second thing, of course, is that as she is going over the scene, a passion of resentment fomented now within me, and whenever Jane's passions get up, watch out. Mrs. Reed looked up from her work. Her eyes settled on mine, her fingers at the same time suspended their nimble movements. Go out of the room, return to the nursery was her mandate. My look or something else must have struck her as offensive, for she spoke with extreme though suppressed irritation. Having a small child sit there and stare at you with a malevolent glare is probably a bit unsettling. I got up. I went to the door. I came back again. I walked to the window, across the room, and then up close to her. Speak I must. I had been trodden on severely and must turn, but how? What strength had I to dart retaliation at my antagonist? I gathered my energies and launched them in this blunt sentence. I am not deceitful. If I were, I should say I loved you, but I declare I do not love you. I dislike you the worst of anybody in the world except John Reed. And this book about the liar you may give to your girl Georgiana, for it is she who tells lies and not I. Mrs. Reed's hands lay still in her work inactive. Her eye of ice continued to dwell freezily on mine. What more have you to say, she asked, rather in the tone in which a person might address an opponent of adult age than such as ordinarily used on a child. That eye of hers, that voice stirred every antipathy I had. Shaking from head to foot, thrilled with ungovernable excitement, I continued. And here's where Jane starts to lose control. Thrilled with ungovernable excitement. Shaking from head to foot. Imagine Mrs. Reed, who's just ordered this child out of the room, a child whom she already suspects is not quite well balanced. And the child has come back and confronted her with these words, and is standing in front of her, shaking, her eyes red with rage, her voice dripping with scorn and hatred. It's almost like the child is possessed. I am glad you are no relation of mine. I will never call you aunt again as long as I live. I will never come to see you when I am grown up, and if anyone asks how I liked you and how you treated me, I will say the very thought of you makes me sick, that you treated me with miserable cruelty. How dare you affirm that, Jane Eyre? How dare I, Miss Reed? How dare I? Because it is the truth. You think I have no feelings, that I can do without one bit of love or kindness, but I cannot live so, and you have no pity. I shall remember how you thrust me back, roughly and violently thrust me back into the Red Room, and locked me up there to my dying day, though I was in agony, though I cried out while suffocating with distress. Have mercy, Aunt Reed! And that punishment you made me suffer because your wicked boy struck me, knocked me down for nothing. I will tell anybody who asks me questions exact tale. People think you are a good woman, but you are bad, hard-hearted. You are deceitful. Ere I had finished this reply, my soul began to expand, to exult, with the strangest sense of freedom, of triumph I had ever felt. It seemed as if an invisible bond had burst, and that I had struggled out into unhoped-for liberty. Not without cause was this sentiment. Mrs. Reed looked frightened. Her work had slipped from her knee. She was lifting up her hands, rocking herself to and fro, and even twisting her face as if she would cry. "Jane, you are under a mistake. What is the matter with you? Why do you tremble so violently? Would you like to drink some water?" "No, Mrs. Reed." "Is there anything else you wish for, Jane? I assure you, I desire to be your friend." "Not you. You told Mr. Brocklehurst I had a bad character, a deceitful disposition, and I'll let everybody at Lowood know what you are and what you have done." "Jane, you don't understand these things. Children must be corrected for their faults." "Deceit is not my fault," I cried out in a savage, high voice. "But you are passionate, Jane, that you must allow. And now return to the nursery, there's a dear, and lie down a little." "I am not your dear. I cannot lie down. Send me to school soon, Mrs. Reed, for I hate to live here." "I will indeed send her to school soon," murmured Mrs. Reed sotto voce, and gathering up her work, she abruptly quitted the apartment. I was left there alone, winner of the field. It was the hardest battle I had fought, and the first victory I had gained. I stood a while on the rug where Mr. Brocklehurst had stood and enjoyed my conqueror's solitude. First, I smiled to myself and felt elate, but this fierce pleasure subsided in me as fast as did the accelerated throb of my pulses. A child cannot quarrel with its elders as I had done, cannot give its furious feelings uncontrolled play as I had given mine, without experiencing afterward the pang of remorse and the chill of reaction. So, Jane literally loses it. She loses it to Mrs. Reed, and she's savage. She's given her furious feelings uncontrolled play. So, Jane's insanity here, her behavior as if she were a mad person, has immediate repercussions because, of course, she's thrown out of this house into Lowood, a much worse situation, even though she doesn't yet recognize it. And this insane behavior is something that she is going to have to learn to control, because if she doesn't control it, the novel clearly wants us to see that she faces a similar fate to that of Bertha Mason. As the result of her inability to control her outbursts against her aunt and her cousins, Jane is forced to leave Gateshead and is sent to Lowood Academy, the school run by Mr. Brocklehurst, where she finds conditions much harder, less hospitable, and much more restrictive. Her inability to control her outburst has actually led to institutionalization. However, at Lowood, she meets Helen Burns, who incidentally is modeled on her own sister and who did die as the result of being exposed to infection and poor living conditions at a school. From Helen Burns, Jane learns the importance and value of self-control. In Chapter 6, on page 20, Jane has observed Helen being mistreated by a teacher called Miss Scatcherd, who gives Helen relatively severe punishments for relatively minor faults, and who seems to be looking for reasons to pick on Helen. And Jane sees this as similar to the unjust treatment that she herself has been subject to, and is curious about Helen's stoic and accepting response. On page 20, she asks Helen about her behavior. "But that teacher, Miss Scatcherd, is cruel to you." "Cruel? Not at all. She is severe. She dislikes my faults." "And if I were in your place, I should dislike her. I should resist her. If she struck me with that rod, I should get it from her hand. I should break it under her nose." "Probably you would do nothing of the sort, but if you did, Mr. Brocklehurst would expel you from the school. That would be a great grief to your relations. It is far better to endure patiently a smart which nobody feels but yourself, than to commit a hasty action whose evil consequences will extend to all connected with you. But then it seems disgraceful to be flogged and be sent to stand in the middle of a room full of people, and you are such a great girl. I am far younger than you, and I could not bear it." "Yet it would be your duty to bear it if you could not avoid it. It is weak and silly to say you cannot bear what is your fate to be required to bear." I heard her with wonder. I could not comprehend this doctrine of endurance, and still less could I understand or sympathize with the forbearance she expressed for her chastiser. Still, I felt that Helen Burns considered things by a light invisible to my eyes. I suspected she might be right, and I wrong, but I would not ponder the matter deeply. So Helen counsels Jane in a couple of ways that turn out to be useful. One is to consider the effects of one's decisions and behavior, and the other is to recognize that one must quietly and acceptingly endure circumstances when one has no better choice, or when the results of not enduring them could be much worse. She says, "It is better to endure patiently a smart than to commit a hasty action whose evil consequences will extend to all connected with you." So actions have consequences, and one should take those consequences into account before one acts, because one has to bear what one cannot endure. On the next page, page 21, Jane explains to Helen later her eye for an eye philosophy. And though it certainly sounds just and fair, one of the problems with this philosophy is it creates these escalating situations where things get worse and worse. And the reality is that those people on the lower end of the power scale are the ones who take the worst consequences. Helen explains to Jane that she is passively good and says there is no merit in such goodness. And Jane's response is, "A great deal. If you are good to those who are good to you, it is all I ever desire to be. If people were always kind and obedient to those who are cruel and unjust, the wicked people would have it all their own way. They would never feel afraid, so they would never alter, but would grow worse and worse. When we are struck without a reason, we should strike back again very hard. I am sure we should, so hard as to teach the person who struck us never to do it again. You will change your mind, I hope, when you grow older. As yet you are but a little untaught girl. But I feel this, Helen. I must dislike those who, whatever I do to please them, persist in disliking me. I must resist those who punish me unjustly. It is natural as that I should love those who show me affection or submit to punishment when I feel it is deserved. Heathens and savage tribes hold that doctrine, but Christians and civilized nations disown it, because it is very much the eye for an eye, returning evil for evil and good for good philosophy that Jane is describing here. Now, the reason that that's not successful is that, aside from Charlotte Bronte allowing Helen to place this within a Christian doctrine, the problem is that it's also an impractical way of dealing with imbalances of power. And so Jane has to find a better way to deal with circumstances in which the power is on the other side, which for Jane it almost always is. And that comes when she learns how other people respond to her outbursts of emotion, first from Helen. Helen asks Jane to tell her story. In her turn, Helen Burns asked me to explain, and I proceeded forthwith to pour out in my own way the tale of my sufferings and resentments. Bitter and truculent when excited, I spoke as I felt without reserve or softening. Helen heard me patiently to the end. I expected she would then make a remark, but she said nothing. "Well," I asked impatiently, "is not Mrs. Reed a hard-hearted, bad woman?" "She has been unkind to you, no doubt, because you see she dislikes your cast of character as Miss Scatcherd does mine. But how minutely you remember all she has done and said to you! What a singularly deep impression her injustice seems to have made on your heart! No ill usage so brands its record on my feelings. Would you not be happier if you tried to forget her severity, together with the passionate emotions it excited? Life appears to me too short to be spent in nursing animosity or registering wrongs." Jane tells Helen her story, expects sympathy for the injustice that Jane has suffered, but what she gets instead is a lecture on how Jane has been flawed in her response to her injustice. Jane's expression of animosity doesn't gain the sympathy that she's looking for. Now, we can actually trace this back to Adam Smith in his discussion of sympathy, when he explains that people tend not to want to sympathize with unpleasant or harsh emotions. That when someone is expressing anger or hate or something that's unpleasant, even if it's justified, we don't want to sympathize with those emotions. When it comes to unpleasant emotions, we sympathize much more readily with emotions that are suppressed or controlled because we gain admiration for and have sympathy with the ability to control strong emotions. And Jane is learning that one is able to better gain sympathy when one is able to control and suppress one's emotions. Jane's opportunity to put this into practice comes on page 26, after a traumatic event that we will look at in just a moment, when she has an opportunity to explain her story again to Miss Temple. Having explained her story to Helen Burns and not getting the sympathetic response she hoped for, she gets to try again with Miss Temple. On page 26 in the second column, Miss Temple says, "Well now, Jane, you know, or at least I will tell you, that when a criminal is accused, he is always allowed to speak in his own defense. You have been charged with falsehood. Defend yourself to me as well as you can. Say whatever your memory suggests is true, but add nothing and exaggerate nothing." I resolved in the depth of my heart that I would be most moderate, most correct. And having reflected a few minutes in order to arrange coherently what I had to say, I told her all of the story of my sad childhood. Exhausted by emotion, my language was more subdued than it generally was when it developed that sad theme. And mindful of Helen's warnings against the indulgence of resentment, I infused into the narrative far less of gall and wormwood than ordinary. Thus restrained and simplified, it sounded more credible. I felt as I went on that Miss Temple fully believed me. Now this is an essential lesson for Jane, because as opposed to her bitter and truculent story that she told Helen, which gained no response, when she tells it to Miss Temple, she says that she is going to be most moderate, most correct. She is going to moderate her emotions. So she arranges coherently her story. She controls her emotions, and her language was more subdued than it generally was when it developed that sad theme. And avoiding the indulgence of resentment in response to Helen's advice, she infuses into the narrative far less of gall and wormwood than ordinary. Thus restrained and simplified, it sounded more credible. I felt as I went on that Miss Temple fully believed me. So she gains credibility. She gains the sympathy she's looking for by controlling herself and controlling her own emotions. Restraint for Jane doesn't just mean controlling herself, but also controlling how she affects other people and how other people respond to her. And that's a very important lesson for Jane, because it will serve her through the rest of the novel, that when she controls herself, she is also able to control how other people respond to her. Self-control becomes, in its own way, a kind of power. On the other hand, as we will learn from Blanche Ingram and especially from Bertha Mason, self-exposure, letting other people see what's hidden below the surface, means surrendering power to other people, and people who are too exposed are also at the mercy of others. In an earlier scene in the same chapter, on page 24, Jane learns from Helen's experience and behavior to control herself in the face of the surveillance of others. Jane is trying to avoid being watched by others. Mr. Brocklehurst comes into the school, is giving a very self-righteous and pompous address to the students. Jane is hiding in the back of the room, but she accidentally drops her slate, the tablet made of actual slate. And being a brittle stone, the slate breaks and makes a noise and calls attention to Jane, which is exactly what she was trying to avoid. Having called attention to herself of Mr. Brocklehurst decides he is going to make an example of Jane and subject her to the public scrutiny that Jane has been trying to avoid. Jane. At the beginning of this section, Miss Temple tries to calm Jane by telling her she won't be punished. "Don't be afraid, Jane. I saw it was an accident. You shall not be punished." The kind whisper went to my heart like a dagger. Another minute and she will despise me for a hypocrite, thought I, and an impulse of fury against Reed, Brocklehurst and Company bounded in my pulses at the conviction. I was no Helen Burns. And so now we have this impulse of fury bounding in her pulses at the conviction. So she's getting ready to have another Jane moment and break out. "Fetch that stool," said Mr. Brocklehurst, pointing to a very high one from which a monitor had just risen. It was brought. "Place the child upon it." And I was placed there, by whom I don't know. I was in no condition to note particulars. I was only aware they had hoisted me up to the height of Mr. Brocklehurst's nose. He was within a yard of me. Mr. Brocklehurst hemmed. In other words, he clears his throat. "Ladies," said he, turning to his family, "Miss Temple, teachers and children, do you all see this girl?" Of course they did, for I felt their eyes directed like burning glasses against my scorched skin. So Jane is being subjected to exactly the kind of public scrutiny she's been trying to avoid. "You see she is yet young. You observe she possesses the ordinary form of childhood. God has graciously given her the shape he has given to all of us. No signal deformity points her out as a marked character." Who would think that the evil one had already found a servant and agent in her? Yet such, I grieve to say, is the case. A pause in which I began to steady the palsy of my nerves and to feel that the Rubicon was passed and that the trial, no longer to be shirked, must be firmly sustained. Now this is the beginning of Helen's influence, that she's beginning to steady her nerves and is firmly sustaining the trial. The Rubicon is one of the rivers surrounding Rome, and when Julius Caesar brought his army across the Rubicon, it signaled the start of his attack on the Roman Republic and was the point of no return. My dear children, pursued the black marble clergyman with pathos, this is a sad, a melancholy occasion, for it becomes my duty to warn you that this girl, who might be one of God's own lambs, is a little castaway, not a member of the true flock, but evidently an interloper and an alien. You must be on your guard against her. You must shun her example. If necessary, avoid her company, exclude her from your sports, and shut her out from your converse. Teachers, you must watch her. Keep your eyes on her movements. Weigh well her words. Scrutinize her actions. Punish her body to save her soul, if indeed such salvation be possible. For, my tongue falters while I tell it, this girl, this child, this native of a Christian land, worse than many a little heathen who says its prayers to Brahma and kneels before Juggernaut, this girl is a liar. Now came a pause of 10 minutes, during which I, by this time in perfect possession of my wits, observed all the female Brocklehurst produce their pocket handkerchiefs and apply them to their optics, while the elderly lady swayed herself to and fro, and the two younger ones whispered, "How shocking!" So, Brocklehurst is not only accusing Jane of being an outcast, worse, he is demanding that she be constantly studied, scrutinized. And Jane's response, interestingly enough, is to regain perfect possession of her wits, to control herself in the face of this scrutiny. Farther down, she's left on the stool, told to sit there for an hour while everyone watches her. There was I then, mounted aloft. I who said I could not bear the shame of standing on my natural feet in the middle of the room was now exposed to general view on a pedestal of infamy. What my sensations were no language can describe, but just as they rose, stifling my breath and constricting my throat, a girl came up and passed me. In passing, she lifted her eyes. What a strange light inspired them! What an extraordinary sensation that ray sent through me! How the new feeling bore me up! It was as if a martyr, a hero, had passed a slave or victim, and in passing parted strength in the transit. I mastered the rising hysteria, lifted my head, and took a firm stand on the stool. Helen Burns walks past Jane, gives her a look that reassures her, and Jane gains control of herself because Jane is heading into one of those Jane moments where she's about to blow up as the result of her passions taking her control. But instead, with Helen's reassurance, she mastered the rising hysteria, lifted up my head, and took a firm stand on the stool. Now, hysteria is an interesting word here because the term hysteria is actually a medical term at the time which describes a very specific form of madness, that is, the madness of women. In medieval medicine and a belief system that lingered into the 19th century, it was believed that if a woman was not married by an appropriate age, and that would be by her late teens, she risked what was known as the wandering womb disease, which was also known as hysteria. You'll note that the root word of hysteria is the same root word as hysterectomy. So hysteria, or the wandering womb disease, according to the belief, was that if you were not properly married, if you didn't have a man to fix your womb in its place, it would detach itself, wander through your body, and attach itself to other organs, causing an imbalance of the humors, which would result in insanity. So hysteria, being hysterical, is specifically a form of female madness caused by not being properly fixed into one's role as a wife and mother by a man. And so Jane's rising hysteria is specifically the same kind of female madness that we will see reflected in Bertha Mason later in the novel. And pay attention when Rochester describes the form in which Bertha Mason's madness takes place. It's very specifically linked to sexual misbehavior. And in fact, a woman at the time could be institutionalized for sexual misbehavior, a form of sexual madness which was specifically linked to what they called hysteria. As a result of Jane's exposure to Helen Burns and her doctrine of endurance, Jane learns that the most successful way for her to control others is to control herself, especially when others are staring at you, especially when under the surveillance of others. And this will become a lesson that becomes essential to her later when she is confronted with Rochester and his attempt to break down these defenses of self-control.